welcome you to the third session titled From the Periphery, Impact of COVID-19 on Education in the Northeast, part of our ongoing EduAction webinar series, Rethinking Education in a Post-Pandemic World. We at EduAction felt it was pertinent to have a session focusing exclusively on the Northeast, with more than 400 linguistic communities in the entire region, and several of them living in isolated or remote areas. Delivery of education has always been a unique challenge in the region. However, the magnitude of disruption in education in the time of COVID-19 has been unprecedented. Today's session will focus on how the government, education organizations, and civil society organizations have responded to this crisis. We have a very exciting session ahead of us today with a rich and diverse panelists comprising of policymakers, educationists, and development practitioners whose inputs will be crucial in understanding how we could go about in planning and developing resilient education systems in the Northeast. I would first like to introduce Dr. Kalyan Chakravarti, IAS. He's not part of the session yet, but he'll join in soon. He's the Principal Secretary to the Government of Assam and is in charge of the elementary, secondary, and higher education departments. The arduous responsibility of ensuring that almost 47,000 government schools and 2.3 lakh teachers function by maintaining the prescribed standards. Besides, he also oversees the efficient implementation of flagship programs such as the midday meal scheme. He has held various important positions previously in the Government of Assam, Government of Telangana, and Government of India, including Department of Finance, Agriculture, Revenue, Land Revenue, etc. He has a BTech from IIT Chennai and a postgraduate of management from IIM Ahmedabad, Bachelor of Law from Osmania University, and has recently completed his PhD in Management of Economics from Osmania University. Next, I welcome Ms. Niharika Rai, IS. She is the current Commissioner, Department of Education to the Government of Arunachal Pradesh. She looks after approximately 3,000 government schools spread across the nook and corner of Arunachal Pradesh, including the remote locations in the Indo-China international border. She holds a Bachelor of Commerce from Sri Ram College of Commerce, University of Delhi, and has done her Bachelor of Law at Law Faculty, University of Delhi. As an 𝗥𝗏𝗫 cadre officer, she has served previously in the Union Territories of Chandigarh, Mizoram, and New Delhi, and her portfolio includes the Ministry of Water Resources, Ministry of Statistics, and Ministry of Youth Affairs. I also welcome Dr. Kalpana Sarathi. She is the Deputy Director of the Tata Institute of Social Sciences at the Guwahati Campus. She is also Professor in Social Work at the Center for Public Health School of Social Work, TISS Guwahati. She holds a Master of Social Work from University of Madras, Master of Philosophy in Psychiatric Social Work from NIMHANS, Bangalore, and a PhD from Center of Social Medicine and Community Health from JNU, New Delhi. Before she began her career in academia, she was involved in counseling at a Women's Resource Center at an NGO in Delhi. She then went on to teach at University of Delhi and then University of Mizoram, where she successfully guided several MPhil and doctoral candidates. Her research interests include areas of health and mental health, HIV/AIDS, and risk behavior. I welcome Mr. Mrinal Gohai, who is the National Senior Lead and the Regional Manager of the Northeast Regional Office, ActionAid. His experience at ActionAid alone spans over 22 years, which is to lead the organization's work to further the rights of communities across the states of Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Nagaland, and Mizoram through their work on promotion of education, community development, ecology and environment, informal workers' rights, and sustainable and dignified livelihood. He's also a former officer of the Assam Civil Service, and during his tenure, he's worked extensively on grounding the District Primary Education Program, DPEP, and Sarva Shiksha, now Samagra Shiksha program in Assam. He is also the chairperson of the Interagency Group Assam, a coordination and advocacy network comprising of over 40 international and national civil society organizations working on emergencies in Assam and NE in the Northeast. Lastly, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our moderator for the session, Professor Poonam Kakati Bora, PhD from JNU, from the Department of Studies, works extensively on areas of sexuality studies, queer theory, and political. She's published several articles as well as nature dichotomy, published by academic publishing. Ma'am,
Your voice was breaking, Tanvi.
my voice breaking. Ma'am? Hello? Ma'am, you can-
Just the last introduction was not very clear, Tanvi. I think we
can move
some
forward.
disruption in the audio. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Maybe
okay.
we
I'm so
can-
sorry about that.
That's okay.
Should I repeat it, or ma'am, would you like to go ahead with the session? I think I should repeat it.
No, I think we should just move forward.
Okay, all right, all right.
Yeah. So thank you, Tanvi, and thank you, EduAction, for organizing this immensely necessary panel discussion with eminent speakers coming from the policy background, as already Tanvi has told us, academicians, activists. And this is very much necessary so that we can talk about in a stakeholder kind of a process about the governance of education, which is at the, which is the backbone of our future at all, and which has been severely impacted by the COVID-19. So not only at the national stage, but also regionally, and more so in the Northeast because of the connectivity issue, just like we have seen right now. The disruption of internet services has actually meant that education has suffered a lot. How have actually the government tried to handle it? How have educational institutions tried to handle it? How have civil society organizations that have been working towards promotion of education have handled it? It's a very big question. We all as practitioners understand the importance of education that needs to happen ceaselessly, and how learning outcomes can be affected as and when pandemics like this strike. And especially because we are again looking at another possibly, unfortunately, at the third wave, we need to think about how we can take this forward. With this brief comments, I will not want to stand between the deliberations that our esteemed speakers have for us in front of us. I would want to hand it over to our first speaker for the day, but I think since our first speaker has been kept busy because of his administrative responsibilities, maybe I can request Ms. Niharika Rai to, take her deliberations forward. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes, yeah. I also request all our speakers to please keep a time of something like 10 to 12 minutes for the beginning comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Poonamji, thank you, Tanvi, and all my fellow panelists for the day. I want to thank EduAction, and I want to thank Child Aid Network for inviting me to this webinar today. And indeed, as it was being said, it's a very important topic, and it's a new of its kind situation, which arose, of course, in the entire world, but it was more challenging in a place like this, because I would like to highlight that how Arunachal is, as most of us must be knowing already, that it's a very, very big, geographically very big state, and we have 83,000 square kilometer plus area. And the schools here and all the educational institutions here are so much dispersed geographically that even in normal times to keep a tag of the monitoring part and to know what is happening in the remote areas is itself a task. And we completely depend on the field staff and all the people out there who can tell us like how the system is working in the interiors and remote areas. So there came a situation 2 years back when suddenly everything came to a standstill, and it was very, very difficult to contact even our field functionaries, because since I'm talking about the time like March 2020, when suddenly there was a lockdown and we were not prepared for it like rest of the country. We were not prepared that how things would move from here. We were in midst of a summer vacation. I mean, the end of the academic session vacation, and we were actually not knowing how the things would go from here. Now, this is a state which is, in the PGI index for education, it is almost towards the end. It is one of the states which is ranked last. So otherwise also there are so many issues, because infrastructure here itself is a big problem, because the schools that were made and built here are of Assam type infrastructure, and they were renovated last during probably the Chinese war time, and after that there is a lot of infrastructure issues. And 50 to 70% of the area here is not connected at all with internet, or some parts are even claiming that the electricity is erratic. So we had a lot of issues that how to deal with such a situation. And then came a time when we had to open the schools for the teachers, when the lockdown, that situation started improving, or what we can say that we were allowed to have some relaxations. Then we asked our teachers to, start coming to the schools. But again, the situation was such that the students were not allowed to come. So how to use those teachers, how to utilize them was again a challenge. Then we are in a type of a system here that, some schools have hostels, and, children from the remote areas and the bastis, which we call here the villages and those areas, they come to that inter-village schools or that model schools or residential schools, and they study there, staying there. So a time came, when everybody went back to the basti, and we didn't have any means of communicating with them. So let alone online system, which was not applicable in 50 to 70% of the areas, but wherever it was also, the students were not residing there in the vicinity of the school that, the teachers could contact them for conducting online classes. They were sitting in their bastis, in their villages, and they could not be contacted. In fact, it created a reverse situation where the online classes were being conducted in some parts, and the students who were not able to attend it, they started making hue and cry of it, because they started communicating in their own ways that, we are sitting in the villages and you are starting the classes online, and how would we cope up and all that kind of thing, that there was a problem. Then in this scenario, transporting of the textbooks and all that material during this period was a big problem, because apart from it, in the normal times also it is a problem, but no transportation facility available. And then generally what we used to do when students come to schools, you can give them all their benefits, or you can, put it in their accounts. But once they are, they're all in different parts and you don't know what to do with them. So this was a bigger problem, that how to give them the benefits, especially the textbooks. So we had to give them to the schools, and schools used to call the parents day by day to distribute the books, and itself it was a big task. Then these states in Northeast, I'm sure that most of the people who belong from Northeast would agree that these states are affected a lot by things like drugs. So the thing is that schools and education is a way of engaging the students all over. Now here came a situation when everybody was sitting at home, and we were quite concerned that how would we engage the students so that they don't get engulfed by all the wrong habits more. So this was again a problem. I'm just quoting the problems that we faced during this time. Then this is one state where the pre-primary education is not there in a big way. The student used to come in first standard. The student comes here first time in the school in first standard. And when a child is supposed to know about things like writing in cursive or one line reading of a sentence, they identify the alphabets for the first time. And here is a situation now we are in. The student who is supposed to now be in a third standard has yet not seen the face of the school, because in the last 2 years, the schools have been very erratically opened and closed. So this was again a problem which we were facing. Now, just a glimpse, because of shortage of time, I would not like to highlight more on these issues. So I just want to make you understand that how problematic the situation was, or rather it is continuing. And in this scenario, without any precedence and without any knowledge of how to cope up with this situation, we were in the midst of it. So how did we tackle? What best we were able to do, that I would like to highlight. First and foremost, we realized that if internet is not reaching to the last mile, probably television would, or the radio would, because people here listen to All India Radio. So for the primary school kids from here in the All India Radio Center in Itanagar, we started the radio schools. We started some folk tale classes for the primary kids, some sessions for them, so that they get engaged and they don't lose that habit, which they are now inculcating for the first time to study. For 6th to 8th standard, we took help from Information Broadcasting Ministry. We were given the Doordarshan local channels here, which we call 𝗏𝗏 channel we have here. And from 𝗏𝗏 network, we used to give daily 6 to 8 standard. We used to take classes or through the television and all, and students were asked to listen all over, and it worked. And because we started getting queries in return, in writing from them on the channels, that we tried to make it a two-way process. Then we publicized all about the 𝗏𝗏 channels and all the ministry channels which are available for education of the higher standard students. We started popularizing them so that, but this was the max that we could do, because as I was saying, monitoring and ensuring that a child is sitting in front of the television and, taking that education and and it's a one-way process, more or less it's a one-way process. So if child is unable to understand, then the child was completely lost, because a normal tribal family would not be able to teach their kids. This is a stark reality, because we have 26 tribes here and 100 sub-tribes with different languages, and some of them having their own scripts. So it is not possible for anybody to communicate with any other tribe to understand anything. And Hindi and English is, not spoken in those interior parts. So it was very difficult for homeschooling to be started in these areas, where we could give the textbook to the parents and ask them to start taking classes. The normal tribal person who goes for Jhum cultivation even today can't, you can't expect them to have this. Average size of the family being 4 and 5 with kids in the home, you can't even expect them to have individual devices. So that was again problem, even if you started online classes, let's say in Itanagar, but the children would not have devices. So everything was going away. So what we did was we tried to make use of television. We roped in the community. We asked our community-based organizations that if you have volunteers, if you have certain kids who are, who are up in 10th or 12th standard, who have just passed out, who are not going to colleges because the colleges all over the country are closed, who are still here in their bastis, we request them to start taking classes or start teaching their kids in the villages and the community, so that at least, the children should not lose the habit of studying. Because now what we are facing is, it's a reality again. In these 2 years, students have given up the habit of studying. And somehow they have got used to this notion that online giving of examination and online, it's an easy process because of various reasons known to us. So they all want to, now go for this online system. Ki theek exams aayega to hame aise hi padha dijiye, and we will pass it, and we will not like to study hard. So anyways, a state which West kids were not used to study, it was going backward. So that's why we asked them to go for community-based, studying, that, you should not give up that habit. Then what we did, we created a central studio here in Itanagar with the help of VSATs. And with the BBNL project of the IT ministry, of the Ministry of METI, we started putting VSATs in certain schools. Now, in remote areas, the thing is that enrollment would be somewhere like 20, 30, 40 students in a school. So to call them to the school in the village with only 5 students coming in a day, or, it was not a problem with all the SOPs. So we thought if we could put VSATs in the schools, and, the online classes are transmitted through here, then it would be a game changer. So we worked in this regard. Then once I tried to send worksheets to all the 2 lakh students I have in the state, I thought, I asked my SCRT, work day and night, make some worksheets to send to all the things. We will send to diets, and diets will send it to schools, and schools will send to their kids in the vicinity. But this entire exercise of sending the worksheets once in such a geographically dispersed state was like, it took so much of time and so much of expenditure that we could not repeat it. But of course, we did it once. So this was one mechanism we did. And ultimately, when nothing worked, we opened the schools. This was the last thing that we realized, that, if nothing is working, and since, geographically dispersed state has an advantage, that population also resides, in very small pockets. So students and parents, not exactly students, but parents started requesting us that you open the schools, let alone COVID be on one side, you open the schools. Because teachers are coming to the schools. The total enrollment in that school is something like 30, 40. If you do SOPs, if you do shift wise, there is no harm. You open the schools. And finally, in the month last year also, and this year, this year we were like probably one of the states who opened it the fastest. We opened all our schools in August, September, from 1st to 12th standard. And wherever any problem came, we followed the SOPs. and everybody was on board, the parents, the students, the teachers, and SOPs were followed, child was taken away, and the schools continued. So this was one thing. And one more problem that has now come is, after coming of the encrypted version of conducting board exams and question papers after CBSE, now downloading it in the interiors and giving those question papers is again becoming a big task. So but we are trying to cope up with that, and this is the problem. We are now relying on things like internal assessments and more of interactive kind of education, which was not there before, which was only textbook based, because we know that we cannot make this child understand the entire textbook in 2-3 months. We have to rely on alternate academic calendars. So therefore we have to, we are now moving towards interactive session, which takes me to the point of the NEP again. Now NEP, what we have done here is, since I'm coming to the NEP point, we are now focusing in NEP on the promotion of the mother tongue, which is a very important component here and which we are rich at in this state. So wherever there is a script available for the tribal language, we are developing pre-primary school kits and the material, because at that level, the students the children still know their native language in their homes. So because parents can only teach them, they're still not used to Hindi and English. So we tell them their way of life, we tell them about their festivals. Through we have developed that kind of curriculum for us now, and that books are available. We can share that books also. So that we are doing in NEP. We are also promoting a lot of vocational education, because that is again the state which is rich at. Now, vocational is not only what is being meant at coding or things like computer. It is like knowing the native things, knowing the native crafts, native kind of weaving and things like that. So that is being promoted, that we are doing here. And we have launched a Mission Shiksha program here this year. This year is the year of education in the state. So it has 8 and 9 verticals, which we are working on, right from administrative reforms to continuous evaluation of teachers, which is not happening, them being in the remote areas, a concrete transfer posting policy, a lot of teacher education, because we are using this time to hone the skills of teachers, which I think should have been used in a better way all across the country. When teachers were free, and they could have taken more of education, when education themselves and hone their skills and things like that. So this is how we are tackling with the situation. It's not a very happy situation, I like to say, but we are still working on it, and the Ministry of Education is helping us, because they understand that northeastern states are facing double problems as compared to the areas which are very well connected. So these are some of the things which we have done and which we are working on. And I hope with the normalcy coming back in some time, we will be able to come back on track. And the things that we have learned, that making more use of technology and keeping children engaged is the need of the hour. And roping of the community is the most important thing. You cannot do anything about this situation till the community works in cohesiveness and everybody is together on it. So this is my take on education in the COVID times in Arunachal. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Niharika. That was really insightful about how we are grappling issues and still being able to continue education despite the challenges that have been posed in front of us. Very happy to know about the use of radio and television that has been done, the use of VSATs that you have taken, and also the community-based approach towards education, which have earlier also been emphasized, but was not able to be so successful in all parts of the country. However, what actually one sees from Arunachal Pradesh's experience is that you have actually taken a challenge to be an opportunity and actually transformed it radically. So with that very extremely insightful session from Niharika, we move forward to Dr. Kalpana Sarathi. Ma'am, we look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So actually, since this webinar is on a very, very important topic, and I'm very grateful to EduAction for organizing this webinar, because I think, having these different perspectives of people across the span who impact education is very important. Now let's try and, first let me just put out here what is the perspective from which I'm speaking. Trained as a person in the field of mental health, I think that does inform a lot of my thinking and practice when I'm talking about even a topic like this, especially perhaps when I'm talking about a topic on rethinking education in a post-pandemic world. And when we are moving towards what I would think is probably euphemistically called a new normal, I don't even know if there is a constant state of normalcy. And again, that comes from the understanding on mental health. Normalcy itself might be something like a sliding scale, and what we need to do is constantly perhaps adapt to it. And what has this context of the pandemic really done to impact the way the education sector has been and how it has responded? The fact that we and also I'm locating this talk particularly in reference to higher education. It was very interesting to hear Ms. Niharika talk about Arunachal Pradesh and the work that is being done there with reference to education. I'm talking largely from the context of being in an institute that serves the needs of higher education, particularly to do with the social sciences. The institute itself, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, is an institute that actually most of our programs, if not all, are very field engaged. They are either field informed or field engaged or field intensive even. And so in this context, what happens to education and the way in which we are transacting courses becomes quite an interesting area for discussion, posing several challenges and then looking at what opportunities also it might present and how do we need to strategize or reimagine what the future of education is going to look like in this context. So there is the context of the pandemic. The context of the pandemic has compounded or made more complex a situation where we have already seen and dealt with in the last decade or more with a lot of uncertainty and complexities of several kinds. And I keep recalling about 15 years ago or 20 years ago when we were first talking about the importance that one needs to give to mental health in the years to come. We would keep saying that 2030, probably mental health problems of various kinds would take precedence over every other kind of public health problem that we are talking about. And 2030 is just 10 years away from, or 9 years away from where we are located today. And a large part of this recognition or importance that is being given is also largely due to the pandemic. And so that's the context in which I'm talking. And why this needs to be discussed perhaps right at the outset is the fact that, when we have an understanding that stems from an inability to predict the future, to know what lies ahead. And that's what a number of our students today are facing in the Northeast, elsewhere in the country, perhaps everywhere in the world. When you're registering or enrolling for a course that is meant not just to acquire a degree, but to prepare you to deal with issues as they move forward in terms of employment, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of growth, personal growth or professional growth. But it is located in a context where there is so much of uncertainty about the future. This actually impacts the ability to receive education. So therefore, this becomes very important for us to highlight. And the fact that the pandemic has affected probably all spheres of life, which we are aware, it's not just education, but has affected us in our social sphere, economic sphere, the political, cultural, environmental, and the spiritual sphere, and education being definitely one of that. If we look at actually the changes that have taken place during the pandemic and after, and I was also recalling as Ms. Niharika was talking about the last year, March 2020, we had just sent out a whole batch of students from TISS to different parts of the country for their fieldwork component. And most of them had arrived at different locations in the country on 16th of March. And then we had this notification that asked us to be more careful under the lockdown, the impending lockdown. So we had to recall students from different parts of India, and not recall them back to Guwahati, but asking them to go back to their own hometowns, causing them huge hardships and challenges, because our institute is very is one that is very clearly committed to having students from the Northeast. 66% of our admission is for students of the Northeast. So we had students from every part of the Northeast, and then 33% from the rest of India, and they going out to different places. So it took us by surprise and shock, and I echo the sentiments that the earlier speaker was also making, that this kind of lack of preparedness perhaps to respond to the gravity that this pandemic has posed. And what changed was, it changed the nature of relationships. It changes the entire financial landscape from a micro level to a macro level. And the context of the pandemic also brought in its wake the ability of people and the various impacts of people in terms of loss, in terms of trauma, in terms of bereavement, morbidities that are occurring in families. And we had to move from familiar ways of coping to unfamiliar ways of coping. And so therefore, the levels of frustration that were there, not related to education per se, but in the larger context, also needs to be viewed when we are talking about education. And then we are referring to the changes that occurred in higher education in the context of the pandemic. What has probably changed to us, for those of us who have been now teaching in the last 1.5 years in the context of the pandemic, is that the entire teaching learning environment has been depersonalized. And the fact that we have a virtual introduction to students, we have a virtual rapport building with students, for students that we have not seen on campus, so students who have joined us last year or this year, we are meeting them only online. And then to be able to transact a course, to be able to build perspectives, to have them have the ability to have peer learning, which is severely compromised. The fact that teaching learning environment has changed. They don't know the teachers or the faculty doesn't know the students, we don't know what they are going through. And by the time we get to know, we are very often responding only in a manner of troubleshooting, or responding as soon as we hear about a problem. But the preventative aspects, the promotive aspects that education should also serve is something that we are probably still not able to respond as well. The mentoring has suffered. There are huge costs that students have. There are pedagogical challenges that we all know. When the classroom has shifted from being a classroom to being a small screen within, it could be a mobile phone, as in many cases, or a laptop screen, then what happens to how students are able to receive information. The redesigning of curricula and teaching methods and pedagogies is something that we have been committed to. We have been trying, I won't say with a great degree of success, but to the extent possible, trying to understand, doing surveys from among our own student population, looking at what needs to be done. How do we get faculty to start teaching in an online mode when we have not been prepared to teach online, when we have not designed our curricula for online work? We are just adapting what is an already existing curricula, which was meant for offline teaching, into an online mode. And then the alignment of e-learning with a number of the kind of programs that require field work. How do we reconceptualize a field when it's going to be online? What does the field involve? And what is the degree of ethics and professionalism that can still be there? And most important, of course, there are faculty challenges. Faculty themselves, we hardly ever talk about it. Yes, students also have had tremendous challenges, and so have faculty, so have staff. What kind of administrative challenges we have had while trying to organize education in this period. But most of all, I think what is very, very important for us is how do we still ensure that education that we are designing and that we are delivering or transacting is ensuring equity and access of all and inclusivity. These are issues that we are constantly concerned about. There is, for very often, some of the issues that students have had. I'm going to just take another 2 to 3 minutes and then I will wind up. There is theory disconnect that students have when they are engaging in classes online. We must remind ourselves as faculty, and we keep doing that very often within our campus in Guwahati or across the 4 campuses. We keep reminding ourselves that our students are going through a lot. There is a lot that students are grappling with when they've made their choices to study in an environment in this period of pandemic. So there are challenges to health, there are challenges that they face with reference to technology, loss of livelihoods and families, faculty not being, very prepared, faculty themselves going through losses and bereavements, and the number of social issues that keep happening. And the concept of home and working from home, is something that is sounds very simplistic, but it's really a very complex way of transacting a teaching learning environment, when students also have to deal with household chores and helping out with tasks or looking after as a caregiver when they have people dealing with issues related to death and dying and all of these things. So now looking ahead, when we know that this is the reality, and perhaps nothing that I've said is entirely new, the fact that post-pandemic, what are the ways in which we need to gear ourselves as educators or as faculty is something that we are already beginning to do a lot of brainstorming around. And one of the most important things that I would imagine is that there has to be a recovery of the learning loss that has already occurred in the last 2 years. How do we, this is higher education, how do we help in recovering that learning loss? They've already got small discussions going amongst us, and there are groups of students who give us a feedback that as far as a certain course is concerned or a certain program, there is a certain perspective that we have not been able to develop. How do we do that? So can we think in terms of offline interactions whenever they come back to the campus? So those kind of changes that we need to gear ourselves with. The second aspect is perhaps that there is going to be post-pandemic so-called normalcy. There will be a higher dependence on technology. Going forward, we might move for some of the courses, some of the programs, perhaps for some programs entirely moving from a classroom mode to embracing an online mode with less challenges and more acceptability now, and looking at hybrid classrooms and blended classrooms more easily. Not for all programs, definitely, but perhaps moving into that kind of thinking is something that we might have to be prepared, and therefore equipping ourselves as faculty to be able to be more competent as far as this mode of delivery is concerned. Accommodating needs of students, I think post-pandemic changes, this is also something that we will need to remind ourselves, and looking at how do we develop teaching learning resources that are more easily accessible when we are faced with a pandemic like this. I mean, offline classes, we have a library, we have a cyber library, we have access to internet on the campus, which students can come and avail and be able to utilize. But what do we do when students are not able to have an assured bandwidth connectivity or internet service providing? So how do we then therefore ensure access, equity and inclusion, and looking at what education itself is aimed at achieving and looking at what the NEP has. Yeah, am I up on my time?
Yes, Kalpana, we will definitely come back because this is an interaction that we're having.
That's fine.
Come back. Yes, we'll
Perfect.
come back to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. For the beautiful way in which you have actually talked about the struggles that we constantly face in higher education institutions. Some of your narratives actually seem as a reflection of what we have been also undergoing. And especially the question of how learning requires a stable psychic state, and how the pandemic has affected our psychological state, and therefore how learning loss is not just because of the disruption, but also the mind which has been disturbed a lot. I have the pleasure of welcoming amongst us Dr. Kalyan Chakravarti, who had joined us.
Just a second, I think ma'am has lost network. Yeah, she's back.
The problem of network connectivity still continues. I'm extremely sorry for this interruption. So we look forward to listening about how the education and you especially at the helm of how did you work around the problem that was posed by the pandemic. How did we work around it? Was it successful? What are the major lessons that we learned during the lockdown? And was it successful? If not, what can actually be done, considering that we don't know what is the road ahead and when the pandemic will end? Over to you, sir. I invite Dr. Kalyan Chakravarti to speak.
Ma'am.
So kindly keep your deliberations to 7 to 10 minutes so that we have more time for interview.
Yeah, but I couldn't really get your question, but I understand, like, how did we address the lockdown and what are the lessons forward? So I'll quickly try and not repeat what I think Niharika in Arunachal already said. So the COVID pandemic did hit the state of Assam quite unexpectedly, like in the other states. And the first thing that the education department did immediately on understanding that the schools will be closed was to ask for the telephone numbers of the teachers. That itself was the first big step that we had to really get in touch with them through either the telephone or virtually. And we did face a lot of issues with first the teachers' attitudes in terms of, like, when we were trying to communicate to them through block SMSs, through WhatsApp messages. And we tried to also create lessons on the WhatsApp messages initially. And as Niharika said, we used all possible means like TV, dedicated TV, apps on the telephone. And then I think, in the first 6 months itself, we realized that there is a huge digital divide. And about 40% of the state of Assam does not own mobiles or even have internet connectivity in some of the remote areas. And therefore, we had to request the teachers, even when it was a pandemic, to take the exercises and do it like a Gurukul-like teaching during the pandemic. But yes, the greatest learning during that period of time was that our understanding was that two types. One is that, yes, this could happen again. And just like we are looking at Omicron and the future, that this could be a repetition of these mutations. We were prepared that we must go digital at any cost and try and reach out to as many schools as possible in a digital means. We also understood that because of the fact that the schools were closed down, it had an impact not just on the students but also on the teachers. Am I audible? Am I audible? I just wanted a reconfirmation that. Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you.
Yes, sir, you're audible. You're audible.
Yeah. So it did, like my previous speaker said, that it did have a serious psychological impact both on the students and the teachers. And we could see that, when the schools started, and Assam was probably the first state to start the schools, we had a tremendous amount of deliberation. In fact, we created a number of papers in terms of the health impact it could have on the children, the pandemic could have on the children. We analyzed, in fact, data from across the world to know that the children have 10 times more immunity than the elders, at least for the mutant that was there earlier. And Assam was the first to reopen the schools. Having reopened the schools after the first pandemic, we found that the dropout rate was high. We also found that the teachers were reluctant to come. But during the period of the pandemic, the teachers did try and make videos we did try and make educational videos which we try to reach out to those children who had who had access to internet and who had access to digital devices. What we try to do is create sort of cultural kind of festivals during this period of time. For every cultural, important day, we would ask the children, for example, to light a diya on, on say, the Republic Day or the 15th August, do a particular cultural program and send in their videos. We started something chess, which could be done as a program, through internet. In fact, we made chess compulsory for all the schools in the state of Assam, and therefore we started teaching teachers through the net about how to go about teaching chess, learning chess. We also try to utilize this period of time, because during the period of lockdown, to rebuild the infrastructure to the extent that was possible, and the fact that that there was no kind of schooling or assessments, we try to convert the best of academic knowledge that was there, like the Khan Academy, into the local languages. We found that there's extremely good material which is available, which we could actually give to the children. And we used the time, we contacted Khan Academy, and we contacted other educational hubs to provide us material which we could convert into our local languages. So we tried to utilize the time when we were down. Then we introduced a concept called digital badges for teachers. So what we did is that the teachers, most of the teachers were not digitally able to handle a material, able to utilize digital means of teaching, which will become a norm in future. The blended means, I completely agree that while we cannot go digital, we will need the human touch between the teachers, the students, and the students and students, in order that the learning is more comprehensive, more human, and complete. And but yet, the fact that we have to have a digital edge was not lost out to us. We also had certain very, very important learnings. One is to make the teachers digitally enabled, to give them a digital badge that yes, they're capable of taking on education in a blended mode. And second, we started teaching them new things through the net. Many of the teachers perhaps were never assessed before, and that is something that we thought that we should do in order to assess the teachers. And we could assess the teachers now in a more comprehensive way than ever before, because now we can have tests, we can really assess as to how well the teachers have understood the concepts. We also understood that there was an issue there's something called personalized adaptive learning system. Whenever we have schools which are actually physical, the teachers only teach the front bench, not the back benches, and therefore most of the children, 80% or 70% of the children, are backbenchers. They're left behind. They probably understand something, but they do not really understand the subject well. Now, through digital means, we can really know what is the educational output of each and every child. We understood that there are a lot of advantages because of the lockdown, which we could really input into the system through digitally, and through means by which we can understand whether all the children are learning to the same extent. But yes, there are a lot of challenges in the future. We know that we will have to make blended systems for the future. Curriculum has to be in that manner. Holistic report cards we have to make, which can again be assessed from a central position. In fact, one of the things that Sam is doing is we made an app for attendance. For the first time, teachers, whether they're actually going to the school or not, biometric was not very successful. Now in this age, we know that teachers can take selfies. If they were to take a selfie in their school, I know they have attended the school. This is something, of course, again, it is having a reaction, because many of the teachers sometimes, what time they have gone, what time they have left the school, how much time they have taught the children was not known. But now, because of the lockdown, we were able to explore new tools by which we have made these systems applicable to the to all the schools and the teachers. We also utilize the services of the higher educational institutions during the COVID, while using the same kind of technologies in the higher educational institutions. Most of the assistant professors, lecturers in the higher educational institutions during the COVID time were in the state of Assam were specifically helpful in trying to reach out to the people of Assam residing in other parts of the country, and assuring them of the government of Assam support. So education system contributed to the state of Assam in one way. It also rediscovered itself for the way forward. So, but still, there's a lot of ground to cover. As Niharika also said, NEP provides many things and many kind of objectives, many kind of goals that we need to achieve in the future. And we hope to take it forward. We are trying to look at the pandemic, which has resulted in a huge learning loss as compared to any other sector. We're trying to make the best out of the worst situation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for keeping to time and also again encouraging us to think on the different ways in which the states have handled. In fact, the experiences of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh within our own region can actually give us contrasting ways about how infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure, and whether it has been able to reach all the parts of the country or not, can give us different kind of ways of looking at how education has been impacted. What I could find is that in Assam, it was almost like a go digital kind of a drive, and to take it forward to the teachers despite the challenges, which however was not possible in Arunachal Pradesh because of its geographical distance, because of the infrastructure development which has not happened already in place. Thank you so much. With this, we move forward to Mr. Mrinal Gohai, sir. We look forward to, again, your discussion on the specific issue of how has the pandemic affected education, the learning outcomes, and what has worked, what has not. So I request you to kindly limit yourself to around 6 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
My pleasure, Riley. Well, I think when we speak about education in the Northeast, and I'm trying to deal it in terms of the Northeast, since it's an area where I've been traveling considerably for the last 2 decades plus, with an interest in education. Well, I think it's very obvious, like, we are, there are immense challenges in education for the people in the Northeast. And I'm not even, moving into higher education and focusing more on, primary education, middle-level education, school education, essentially. There are issues of infrastructure, entire geography of the place, huge challenges. You have mountainous places, you have riparian areas. I remember walking to villages where you barely had a school, right? It was this particular school where I had visited in not very far from 𝗙𝗏𝗁𝗁 really, but it's a long walk down about 5,000 steps from there. And I go to a school where I find this very interesting situation where you have a teacher who only teaches in class 1. He's the only teacher in the school, and he only teaches class 1 because that's all he knew. He himself studied the class 1. He's able to teach only in class 1, right? Appointed by some well-intentioned missionaries, right? But these are the different kind of situations you have. You go to a riparian place which gets flooded every year. You have huge accessibility problems elsewhere. Areas which are affected by political strife, conflict. We're hearing news all over the place, border areas, with all the different states. There are very serious political issues. So I think education, ensuring education in many of these places has been immensely problematic. Leave alone issues of language. I think Tanvi had spoken about it, about 400 odd, different languages, dialects. So as it is, and even language has been deeply politicized over the years. So you have all these problems, and then a pandemic, and a pandemic arrives in the middle of all this, and we are trying to figure out how do we resolve it. And mind you, the pandemic isn't over as yet. We're still in the middle of it, and we're only trying to get back to a regular format of education. And we're not entirely sure if we will be able to get back into what was a regular format of education. As always, all disasters, whether it's a flood or an earthquake, has a differential impact on society. So marginalized communities are always more vulnerable. The poorer classes, with castes or the tribes, are always left behind. So very often in our planning, in our thinking, we tend to keep that aside. The general focus is on how do we get our mainstream going, and we forget that the mainstream really should be comprising of all these different elements of different castes, the tribes, the marginalized communities of a state or of a region. I think that requires serious consideration, and that brings me to the fact that many of the means that have been taken up, I'm not going to repeat a lot because I don't have enough time, and I think all the previous speakers have touched on these issues. But taking language as an example, I think most material would have been developed in something like Assamese, perhaps, or in Mizo, or if you're in Mizo, or in Khasi and Garo, if you're in Meghalaya. But what about the fringe languages? They're not really fringe. It's just in our mindset we try to keep them apart, aren't we? Like take a state like Nagaland, which has so many 16 different languages, which are 16 different into languages which can even be a village or cluster village specific. So there are immense challenges, and I think that as it is, if you're really looking into the entire sphere of curriculum and pedagogy, there were challenges in the past. We had, though the effort over the last, I think at least for the last 25 years, I think starting somewhere with Joyful Learning by UNICEF and Lok Jumbish in Rajasthan, our education project, I think the attempt was to bring in a greater involvement, participation of communities in the management of schools, and into what is called joyful learning, child-centric learning, right? That's got themselves entrenched, root learning, teacher-centric methods of teaching, pedagogy, if you call them pedagogy, are too deeply entrenched. We haven't really been able to shake it off. That shift was really required, right? And I think to a great extent, all states, at least in the northeastern region, were still grappling with basic issues of infrastructure, teacher rationalization around schools. And then we had a pandemic, and which is suddenly raising serious questions for us. But then I was thinking, when talking to friends in recent times, aren't we living in a changing world, right? Changing in the sense that look around us, climate change is upon us. Maybe the pandemic is just a harbinger. The entire debate that you had around COP28 and bringing down temperatures to within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial temperatures. It's triggering a lot of new thinking. There's perhaps a new drift in the air, as very often people talk about industrialization. I would also like to think of it as, the hydrocarbon age. As we're drifting out of a hydrocarbon age, the world around us will also change. And this change will happen very rapidly within the next 20 years. If you're looking at what China is doing or America is doing, it is a change, and that change will has to affect us at many levels. The curriculums will have to change at the higher level. And perhaps if you're looking at the NEP and trying to get into reading between the lines, and perhaps some of it is quite, distantly mentioned, you're seeing a drift from what was, strictly academic at one level to literacy and literacy numeracy, programs like Nipun, into vocational, an appreciation of the understanding of what are essential vocational learning. Even research fund is drifting somewhere. I'm not saying neglecting, but drifting from what was more towards a fundamental research into the technological. It's not really new, but I think it's a shift in emphasis, and perhaps that's right. And likewise, I think as this world is changing, as the circumstances around us are changing, as the geopolitics around us are changing, I think there's also a need to bring about the change in the practices. So, while we're trying to develop, a better pedagogy that's more child-centric, more activity-based, more joyful, we'll have to translate it into a new world, right? It will demand for that, because I think there seems to be this pandemic definitely has caused a great fragmentation. Or we are becoming, our learning perhaps is becoming more individualized. That social environment that one of the previous speakers was talking about is perhaps, at least for in the near future, is not absolutely certain as we understood it. The medium has changed. So what are the tools for what are the pedagogic methodologies that we'll be applying? It also remains a very serious question. I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done. So while in the Northeast, we're still dealing with issues of teacher rationalization, school infrastructure, appropriateness of infrastructures, you know, having these teachers trained to a certain practice, there's already a change around. And I think we need to also start deliberating and thinking about what that change would be and how would we be getting around to doing it. I think there's a serious need for a think tank to emerge across the region, involving different actors to take on some of these issues. I think there's an important need to engage with the teaching community, you know, teacher training institutes, but as well with civil societies, because civil societies also bring in a certain perspective. Very serious environmental issues in the region that need to be addressed and brought into our curriculum, into our understanding. Right? And I think those essentially would also require an understanding. We have moved away from, you know, a workplace factory-like idea of a school. We need to essentially into a place which is different, you know, perhaps more fragmented, but which is a completely different learning environment that would require the schools, the infrastructure. We've got to think beyond that. I may be sounding perhaps a little utopian when I'm saying that, but I'm afraid that may end up being the need for the future. I'm going to stop there because I think most of what I would have said otherwise has been said by other speakers.
Thank you for that, Mrinal. What you actually put into perspective for us is the reality for us in Northeast, that we already existed amongst uncertainty, and now we are certain that this uncertainty is going to continue for a longer period of time, that our challenges, you know, are humongous. And to this has been added the pandemic, of course, the context of environmental change, and, you know, the kind of the challenge that the social environment, you know, is posing for education. It gets missing until and unless we dig deeper amongst ourselves. As all our panelists were speaking, what also came into my mind and what is also relevant from the perspective of this webinar series that EduAction has been doing is also of the new education policy. And in that context, I was thinking if, you know, Mrinal and Kalpana could enlighten us on how you think the NEP could actually impact the education in the post-pandemic world. Specifically, the National Education Policy talks about what is called as the National Education Technology Forum. So in some ways, there was a kind of an idea that there has to be technology that is mixed with education. And especially in higher education, we have been talking about MOOCs, massive open online courses. But at primary level, we were not. So how do you think, you know, can we talk about education, thinking about the NEP, and then how it is going to affect education, especially school education, higher education, including in the post-pandemic period, if ever we come to the post-pandemic world, that is. My question, I hope that Mrinal and Kalpana would throw some lights on these kind of issues that I have raised.
I'm just wondering whether Mr. Mrinal would like to go first and then I could follow. Or would you like me to go?
I think you could go and then Mrinal could follow.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, what you did mention earlier as well, just when you were framing the question is, you know, with reference to this whole use of technology, I think that's where the biggest challenges are going to occur. But the NEP itself, you know, has brought about structural changes, architectural changes in the way we are going to be imagining education. But I think, you know, with this whole Digital India initiative that the government has started, and the fact that there is a lot of encouragement to using smartphones, apps, internet-based services across remote and urban areas. I think that's where a lot of the work has to be done even further to strengthen the initiative. And the national education policy itself, I think, besides what you mentioned of the MOOCs platform, Dr. Poonam, I think it's also that, for the school education, particularly the eVidya program or the digital infrastructure program for knowledge sharing, the SWAYAM program, which the government has been actively doing, where we have online courses available. Even in many of our institutes and universities, we have started encouraging students to take some of these courses. So what the NEP does is, I think, throws open a lot of opportunities for students to be able to to enroll in courses that may be offered not just from one location, but across. So that could be seen as an opportunity. And as we look at the other kind of opportunities that are there in the NEP, because this is talking about an academic bank of credits, so students can actually have a break, go back to earning a livelihood, coming back again after some time to enroll again. And because of the credits earned, they can probably register in different universities. So I think a lot of such opportunities are there when we look at the NEP. But yes, one of the major challenges for even students to be using that kind of opportunity to its best has got to be with how sound we are with reference to ensuring access and having digital platforms available on an equal level playing field for everyone.
Well, I think Dr. Sarathi has covered it all. But I was just thinking, crossing my mind, that even as we were talking about the training of teachers, one can see that the entire machinery that we had in place, the infrastructure that we had in place for training teachers on how to transact material with children will have to change. The entire platform will have to change. How do we teach them now, right? I think it calls for a huge change, and I think that in all possibility, like again, going back to anecdotes, just the other day I was talking with a friend, and we were reminiscing, and we were saying that, look, without us understanding, we got into a technology, a huge communications revolution, right? It's like the world changed. It was no longer just a simple telephone that rang at the corner of your house once or twice a day, to a time when we're actually constantly communicating, and look at us actually looking at each other and talking. And I don't know how effectively, because I think there's more to it than just looking at each other's face and trying to smile and or grimace. But still we are doing that, aren't we? Right? We are connecting at a certain level. It's almost science fiction, isn't it? You would have read something like this written by Isaac Asimov or someone like that in the 1960s. And here we are doing it, amazingly, aren't we? Just one step away from teleportation. Who knows? We could be actually, standing in front of each other, in a few years from now. But the point I'm trying to make is that as this shifts, as these changes are happening, perhaps the way we need to communicate with children will also have to change. We were talking about the psychological needs. Yes, of course, right now it's an absolute mess. I'm sorry, I happen to be a guardian of a child as well. And I've seen the kind of pressures that he's facing, because teachers are facing them too. Teachers have taught in a certain way. They themselves have been taught in a certain way, and they have been teaching now in a certain way, right? At best, they're moving to assignments. You give a lecture or you give an assignment, right? And then you give an assignment for the evaluation as well. Isn't it something like that, right? And since no one really has a sense how it's going to go down with the students, right? Adult students or young students, so there's a lot of uncertainty about this whole platform. How is it really going to work? I think there's this pandemic in a way is going to trigger a serious revision. It's not like those online courses that you did with foreign universities in the past, or when one of the IIMs asking you to do a leadership course or on supply chain systems or something like that. This is different. This is mainstream learning that's going to shift, and along with the technology, we really have to understand, we've got to bring in the key elements of in-person learning, like empathy, connecting with the psychology of children, bringing that in that social aspect of learning, right? I think learning is not just about, knowledge. And that's what we all criticize, don't we? Like, about rote learning, the kind of, Victorian learning that we had in place. We had it in place for a very long time. We are still striving to change that. So I think parallelly, many things have to happen, right? Creating new infrastructure for this. And who knows, this might become the norm, right? The pandemic is not over. Who knows, there could be another one again in the future. So that's part of the DRR, this disaster risk reduction, or the disaster risk preparation. How are we preparing for the future as well? I think so. These are the elements that have to come into our kind of thinking, and we better do it real fast. We really don't have too much time. We're already affecting our generation right now. So, thank you.
Absolutely agree there. In fact, a lot of just as a personal sharing of my experience with our students, we did kind of 2 projects on study of the effect of the pandemic on the students of primary education, as well as teachers who are teaching primary school level students. But we clearly also saw that there's a gender dimension to the entire burden. So at some ways, whereas female teachers were facing the brunt of the digital divide because they were not yet, digitally literate. So it impacted teaching. There was the problem of double burden that had increased, the violence that was happening at home as the shadow pandemic. All of that did impact a lot. And, for that, we of course cannot look towards technology to, have solutions for problems of that kind. We also saw, from these smaller studies that we made the students do, through telephonic interviews near their household, basically government schools. We also saw that, girl students still continued. We already talked about how the girl child faces disadvantages when she comes to the school. With the pandemic coming on, the burden actually increased, and especially with devices being scarce. So whenever there is a, division of allocation of resources within the household, we see those differences also on the basis of gender. So one thing that we also need to take care of, if ever we enter into the post-pandemic world, if not at least in the currently residing pandemic world, is also to look at how gender impacts, education. And our policies, of course, then have to, take care of that, as well as education institutions also need to talk about those lines. On that front, because Mrinal sir had mentioned about Lok Jambish, which is one of the most successful projects that was done with a civil society, government organization kind of collaboration. Also, we have had other successful ventures because of the intervention of the voluntary sector. Something like the tent schools in Karnataka, which moves alongside with the children of the migrants, so that their education is not hampered. In Assam, we had schools on boats, so that education is not hampered when the floods happen. And of course, a lot of other organizations like 𝗏𝗏, Teach for India, that have been working to further education. It again, creates in my mind, I'm sure to a lot of our viewers as well, about what could be the way forward when we are talking about the multi-stakeholding kind of venture that could be taken amongst the government, amongst the civil society organizations and higher education institutions. If again, Kalpana and Mrinal could take a lead and tell us, how do we envisage the future role that civil society organizations might have in taking forward education in the post-pandemic world. Hand over to Kalpana.
Yeah, thanks. I think some of it I have mentioned. I mean, it's not just the role of educational institutions, but of considering the fact that the kind of transactions in education that we are going through today is going to impact livelihoods, employment, and all of that. I think the stakeholders that we would require to address these concerns would have to come from different sections of civil society. And whether we are talking about an industry, academia linkage, or a whole lot of other ways in which we can help students who are currently enrolled or going to be enrolled in the future in terms of building up our resource base, in terms of building up infrastructure, in terms of ensuring digital access to people across, so that, like I said, we have a level playing field. And I think, Dr. Poonam, you had also raised an extremely important point with reference to gender, and how do we ensure that the burdens faced on girls and women are lessened, or in some way, how do we address those concerns when we are taking it forward? I think that's where the role of civil society, in terms of acknowledgement and going forward in concrete actions, in terms of building up of partnerships and alliances across civil societies with educational institutions, and taking this forward. Because for life, students who are going through an educational program today will have to be prepared for the entire life. So what are the kinds of support mechanisms, and building up these social support mechanisms, I think, is the way forward.
Well, actually, why civil society, right? Why not just leave it to, specialists, or, a department of the state to kind of take care of it? Of course, they have no denying that, at the end, it's the state which has got to resolve the problems of education to a great extent. They are the final implementers of a thought or a certain consensus, right? But that contract, that social contract, right, around education, that consensus has got to have the participation of different actors, you see? Because what happens often when you're looking at civil society, and by civil society, I just don't want to limit it to NGOs of a certain kind, I mean, civil society would include, trade unions, student unions, small clubs, anyone who's generally interested in it, and it could also include the organic intellectuals, right? Very Gramscian word, organic intellectuals, not necessarily someone, who's an academic, right? But people with insights. I was in a village yesterday in 𝗙𝗿𝗃𝗃, and just as I was leaving, was it yesterday or day before yesterday, and just as I was leaving, this gentleman gives me a book, and I tend to get these books, when you're traveling out. And on my way back, I was just flipping to the pages. I was very surprised, There's very short essays, about 2 pages, 3 pages, 4 pages at most. But they were so insightful on, different aspects of religion and spirituality in Assam as they do it. What am I driving at when I'm mentioning this case? I'm saying that, there are people everywhere. They are interested organic intellectuals, if you call them, just interested persons. You have NGOs who are desperately trying to do something very seriously on the ground, try to make changes on the ground. So you see, it's a wide spectrum that we're inviting when we engage in a conversation, right? And this conversation will bring in different kind of insights. So if you're working, I remember working in Dhemaji at a certain point of time during floods. Schools were not working, people all over the place. And, I had this, talking to people, I gradually got a sense that if there has got to be a school in Dhemaji, it has got to be a school which is, in tune with the annual cycle of floods. Like the life of the Missings are. The Missings are, a classic example of people's adaptation to a riparian environment. The way they do their agriculture, the way they keep their buffaloes, the way they pound their rice, the way they make their houses in stills. We know the last bit first. We don't know so much about that, right? So what I'm driving at again is that conversation has to happen with different kinds of people, NGOs, academics, organic intellectuals, bring in a lot of insights. And it's that engagement with all these different parts of civil society, as I mentioned, students' unions and labor unions. You know, you go to a tea garden, a labor union, perhaps, you know, other civil societies of the tea labor community will give us certain insights as to how schools really need to be run. What are the gaps out there? And in the current environment of a pandemic where we are right now, it'll also mean that, you know, it has got to be done in a way where we are using technology and we are using other means to kind of bring it all together to provide education. Sorry, I seem to have talked a little too much. Thank you.
Not at all. No, not at all, sir. It's very interesting, and this is very necessary to talk about, you know, the conversation that we need to have. And, you know, when we are having a conversation, of course, you know, there's no overriding agent that, you know, take charge of education. It's a collective responsibility. Also, you know, what from all the discussion that we had, you know, it's very important for us to understand the future is going to be, you know, quite revealing for us, that whether I'm sorry, whether we think about education in an instrumental manner or we think about education as being intrinsically valuable, whatever be, the social return that education provides is something that will, and the impact that the pandemic has will be a testimony that will be made in the future. And hopefully by then the learning loss that has already been suffered, we'll be able to cover that. And it is necessary for us, you know, all of us as practitioners and stakeholders of education, whether as be parents, as teachers, as students, as persons in the civil society itself, to constantly reflect on what has the pandemic done. And today, with these four brilliant and exceptionally talented and reflective individuals that EduAction had brought us together, I can very well say that, you know, we have definitely a very bright future ahead. Despite the challenges, this shows the resilience of the human spirit, that we are still trying to think about innovative ways in which education can be carried on. We are constantly conscious about the factors which have been inhibiting education in this period. So in some ways, I believe that this panel has brought together what, when you say margins, we have actually located the discourse at not specifically from the Northeast as margins. These are concerns which have been there, and these are the concerns that need to be located at the center. Only when we focus on the margins, we will be able to make the impact on education as we want to see it as the cast of social change. With that note, we almost approach towards the end of the session. And I would now, since there are no questions that are there in the chat box, we will move forward to having the vote of thanks being proposed by Tanvi from EduAction. Over to you, Tanvi. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. On behalf of EduAction, I would really like to thank you first for your excellent moderation, and also to our illustrious panelists for making time from their busy schedules and joining us today. It was an extremely illuminating session, and I'm sure that I speak for everyone here when I say that we will leave with a lot more being aware of the situation on the ground and how we may possibly forge ahead. I also want to thank the audience for joining us today. Thank you so much. We hope to see you for our next session. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.